Hey everyone, welcome to the second microteach for this semester. This week we're going to be going over Module 9, which is going to be on the lobes and the hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. So let's go ahead and just jump straight into it. So it is kind of a common mistake that the overall mass of the brain is actually what produces our intelligence. And while there is a slight correlation to this, it's definitely not the whole picture. Really, it's what is known as corticalization, which is the relative mass of the cerebral cortex. And what the cerebral cortex is it's a thin, it's a wrinkly layer covering the brain where a lot of the higher ordering processes take place. Excuse me. In this area, there are things like language and tool making that really gives us the intelligence that we have over other species. And this is really our advantage over other species, is this cerebral cortex. Because really, as humans, we're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, we don't have a very thick armor on our skin to protect us. We have to be intelligent, we have to be creative and make things that give us this advantage. And this cerebral cortex can be broken down into two basic hemispheres, and it's easy to remember, it's left and right. And these hemispheres are cross-wired. So generally you have the right side of the brain controlling the left side of the body and vice versa. And if you need a quick way to remember that they are cross-wired, if you can think about a stroke victim, generally if someone's having a stroke, they're having muscle sagginess or numbness in a part of their body. If it's occurring on the right side of their body, it's going to be typically a stroke in the left hemisphere. And these hemispheres are connected by what's known as the corpus callosum. This is a thick band of axon fibers in the center, and this is really processing information back and forth between the two. There is what's known as a split brain operation, where this is severed, this is kind of cut in the center, and it can kind of cause a range of complications because of what's known as handiness or lateralization. And handiness is more discussing your dominant hand, so if you're right-handed or left-handed, and this is affecting what is produced in each side of the brain. So the lateralization portion is talking about the specific abilities of each side of the brain. So generally the left side of the brain is more focused on writing or math, things like that, whereas the right side is definitely nonverbal, more perceptual skills. So severing these two can prove to be catastrophic because there's not that communication between what you're possibly writing and how you're understanding what is being on a page of a book or something like that. Your handiness comes into play because you can have what's known as dominant hemispheres, where some people think they're, I'm left brain dominant or I'm right brain dominant. And there is some truth to this, but it's definitely not like a personality type where you can, I only use my left brain, I am so verbal, or I'm so shy, I must be a right brain person. It's not that simple, but there is definitely a dominant part of this whole structure. Next we're going to kind of getting into the lobes, and it's going to be really important for you to not only remember what's in each lobe, but also where they exist, and I'm going to go over both of these and just try and clarify it as best as possible and help you really remember these two things. So first is going to be the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is going to be easy. It's in the front right here in your brain. And you're going to have what's known as the prefrontal cortex. And this is the very front of the brain involved in the self. And the entire frontal lobe is involved in your executive orders, like I said, your self. And you do have association areas which handle different things. But generally it is your executive functioning. There's also what's known as the Broca's area, and this area of the brain is related to language, but more specifically it's the grammar and pronunciation of language. And that kind of outlines a little bit better this executive functioning that I'm talking about, where it's not really just understanding a word, but possibly a string of words in a sentence and how they're pronounced, how they're supposed to be put in that sentence and things like that. And that is kind of a higher level of thinking versus just a base level of understanding. Next is going to be the parietal lobe, and what helped me in school remember this is I always thought of my parents, that they were kind of older than me, they were above me, and the parietal lobe sits right on top. So if that helps you remember it, if you need to pull something else, obviously use whatever you need to. But really the parietal lobe is involved in sensation. So it's going to be things like touch, temperature, where it's that somatosensory systems. Your book has a great outline in Figure 9. That's the entire brain, and it shows the varying degrees of sensations. If you need to take a look at that. But really it is just the sensations that you're feeling. That's what's being processed and sent straight into your parietal lobe. Next up is going to be the temporal lobe. And a good way to remember the temporal lobe is just think about your temples. The temporal lobe sits on both sides of the brains, directly in the sides, and it is responsible for the hearing portion of any stimuli you get in an environment. So the primary auditory cortex is what's going to receive these auditory cues, and it's going to be sent via nerves straight into your temporal lobe. While you will have language coming through there, that's actually going to take place in an area called the Wernicke's area, and that's just who discovered it, named it after himself. And that's going to be responsible for your language comprehension. So kind of how I talked about the frontal lobe was more than just hearing the language. The temporal lobe is going to be just that auditory cue sent straight into you hearing it, understanding it, and that's kind of it. Then that's going to get sent through your frontal lobe for understanding grammar and things like that. Which is also important to kind of note and put up is that all of these lobes that we're talking about are interconnected. It's not just, one working and then it gets sent to another and that one works. They are interconnected through that corpus callosum, and they're all working together at the same time to give information to you and produce a response from you. The last one's going to be the occipital lobe, and if you can think about it, occipital lobe is going to be your visual. It's going to be your visual response. So if you can think about your eye bringing in light, it has to actually bring light in, bounce the back of the eye where your cones and rods are, and then be sent front of your eye again for an image. So if you can think about that it's got to go towards the back of your brain. That's where the occipital lobe sits. And these images that are coming in are definitely not exactly what you're seeing. You're not watching the TV and it projects a TV image inside your mind. It's going to be very distorted and blurred, and your brain's going to kind of have to sift through that in just kind of a complicated and complex way. And this can produce some odd phenomena. You can have what's known as visual agnosia, where you can actually see something but not be able to identify an object. So you can see a spoon in front of you and know what it is but not be able to produce, oh, that's a spoon. You can also have what's known as facial agnosia, where you can't recognize familiar faces. So just some odd things where it's kind of an odd concept to think that you can see something without seeing something. But if we do go over a couple interesting cases in class, if you want to know more about it. But other than that, that's going to kind of complete this week's microteach. And if you have any questions, definitely feel free to shoot me an email. But other than that, I'll definitely see you guys next week in our next microteach. Thanks.